All right, welcome back. We're going to talk now on Module 2, which is all about ancient Egypt, the most glorious and wonderful ancient civilization. No, I kind of kid. There's going to be a little bit more in this module in terms of video lectures, not too much more, but we're actually going to cover this in kind of two parts. So, and we'll also go back and talk a little bit more about Mesopotamia in the next couple of modules as well. But we're going to cover this more or less. We're going to try and cover it in two modules. That means that we're going to cover about 3,000 years of history on Egypt. Now, if you're looking at the slide here, if you look at what we have here, this is ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs here, and it says Comet. The bird in the middle is, that's an M, and the hieroglyphs here, this is a K here, and then the last one is a T. So you actually have, it's like a little loaf of bread actually, but you have KMT Comet, and what Comet means is black land, which is a reference basically to the very rich alluvial soil of the Nile River when it floods. And then the waters recede, just like in Mesopotamia. It leaves behind what we might think of as topsoil or silt. But it's really just rich alluvial soil. It's churned up in the rivers, and it's very nutrient-rich coming back from the river as it floods. It's very dark and almost black in appearance, and so they call it the black land. And the land where the soil really is dark, and they recognize it's good stuff to grow crops. They don't know all the technicalities of the nutrients and how it works, but they do understand you can grow crops there, so they named their nation after the region. And I think it's a pretty easy thing to remember, Comet. Just kind of remember that for quiz and test purposes for the most part. The Nile really flooded pretty reliably on an annual basis up until about the 1960s when they built the Aswan High Dam, which of course was so that people could control more or less the waters of the Nile. But this is life in Egypt. There's two things that I think explain the remarkable longevity of 3,000 years of Egyptian history, and those are the Nile River and the concept of Maat, which we will definitely talk about in the lecture. Naturally, because they're so dependent on the Nile, as the Egyptians saw it, it was a force of creation for life, and they attach different deities to it at different periods of time. Poppy is the god that's really associated with the Nile the most often, but it also creates the Nile and other rivers and other gods who he creates through his speech, and we're going to read about that in one of the primary sources. So it's surprising us kind of how much these rivers really, really make a difference early on, and how much they put that into their ancient religions, and how they end up worshiping it and want to keep it happy and want to keep it flooding at a nice, reliable way. At times it can flood very destructively, and at times they have drought. But by and large, compared to every other region we're talking about, basically Egypt is drought-proof. I mean, it happens, but it rarely happens. And Mesopotamians have to work this rocky soil and more unpredictable rivers, and other cultures talk about having to rely on smaller rivers and rain and not abundant rain. So Egypt is basically, because of the situation it's in, becomes the breadbasket of the ancient world for a long time. Ultimately, it's why Rome wants to end up conquering Egypt. If you kind of fast forward a bit, it becomes, even after they come in, it becomes the breadbasket of the entire Roman Empire. And that's just the Nile. And so understand, where the Nile reaches, there's life. Okay, you can see that here. I mean, this is green, just a quick rendition of the point, but I think it makes it pretty clear where the Nile floods and where those waters reach, people can irrigate. They can collect river water, right? You see this is arable land right along that river. And they'll make canals to grow fields and crops, and when the water recedes, they'll drain the basins that they collect that in, which we saw Mesopotamia did similar things. They'll plant crops in those basins, just like in Mesopotamia, with one big difference. It's easier in Egypt because the soil is not as rocky as it is in Mesopotamia. Another great illustration here, this kind of is difficult to really comprehend to some extent. This is a corona, yes, it's called a corona satellite image from the 1960s, and it's public domain now, but it looks like you took a white picture and someone took a pen and just scribbled a line and then let some kid take a green highlighter and try and follow the black line. No, that's not actually what this is. What this is the black line is the river, and the green line from satellite imagery is plant growth. Everything else is desert. It's a really powerful way to illustrate just how much life the Nile would be able to give, and you don't have to have rain. Of course, I mean, you need the rain, and that helps, but the river is what's bringing the life. Outside of that, not much life. Reviewing kind of from the first module, this was taken standing at the top of basically like a temple, but you can kind of see along the river, basically a little bit elevated, and you can see the vegetation and then the mountainous arid region, right? It's like you just take a line and draw it, boom, and then you have all this growth and plant life and then nothing. And this part down here is what they call the black land, right? And it's referring to that soil, remember, and of course, good vegetation. And then you have what they call the red land, and up here is the red land, all right? And this is the two different types of soil that are in Egypt. So if you learn really anything, you got to understand just how important the Nile was to the Egyptians. And so how do we know about all of this stuff with Egypt? Well, it really goes back to Napoleon. When he conquers Egypt in the late 1890s, he brings with him a team of scholars and scientists, and he's very, very interested in Egypt. He wants to understand ancient Egypt and their history. He wants to learn about the flora, the fauna, the animals, the plants. He wants to learn all this because he wants to see how to improve life like they did in Egypt. So he brings these scholars with him, and one of them was Jean-Francois Champollion, and he's the man that is responsible for cracking the hieroglyphic code. And this is really only possible thanks to something called the Rosetta Stone. And yeah, you may be aware of the Rosetta Stone because of this stone right here, which I've actually put eyes on this stone. They had it in London at the Museum of London when I went there. I've actually got a chance to look at the Rosetta Stone, but you may also know it from like the commercials where it's like, hey, learn Spanish in 5 days with the Rosetta Stone, right? But that's kind of how they named it. And basically what you have here, and what is crucial about it, it's 3 groups of text. And you kind of have this line here, and you can kind of see a difference up here, then a second grouping of text, and then a third grouping of text. Okay? And in the first group, you have hieroglyphs, all right, hieroglyphics. The second group, you have kind of a more fancy way of doing hieroglyphs called demotic. It's kind of a latter form of hieroglyphs, like cursive, if you want to think of it that way. And then down here, you have Greek. And what is important about this stone is that of the 3 languages, 2 of them died out. So they were impossible to try and translate. But since you have the same message written 3 times, and one of those languages is Greek, which never died out, you're now able to go and decode the rest of the 2 above it. And so it takes a lot of legwork, and it takes over a decade, but Champollion devotes the rest of his life trying to figure out what these hieroglyphs mean and finding hieroglyphs other places. And so to his credit, that's really how we know so much about the Egyptians. With Egyptian and Mesopotamian cultures, we of course have polytheism, the belief in many gods, which is an obvious quiz question. And really every group we talk about in Unit 1, with the exception of the Israelites or known as the Hebrews, they're all polytheists, other than that group, who are the only monotheists in the ancient world in terms of a whole culture. So this is the part of ancient life, right? Polytheism. So like Egypt, Mesopotamia, Rome, they're all polytheistic. And there's just a few individuals and cultures who aren't. In this scene, we have a scene where you basically have this wealthy Egyptian. You see him here, and you see him here in the white clothes, and he is basically going before the gods at his death. And up here you have a row of 9 gods, the Damid, and so boom, 9 gods right away, polytheism. And what is being depicted here is that they are weighing his heart to see if it's light as a feather, which is Maat, because basically Maat means truth, justice, and order and righteousness. So if his deeds and his heart balance out with Maat, he'll have a blessed afterlife. And we'll talk about Maat in a few minutes. But he's describing his life to the gods. He's got a tablet and a stylus, right? And he's taking a record of everything the guy says, and they bring him before Osiris, who's green right here at the very end, and Isis and Nepsis are behind him back here. And within this one scene, we see about a dozen gods, right? It's a scene of polytheism right there. And we'll give you a little bit more information as we kind of go, but one of the things the Egyptians are doing, you'll see in these clips here also, that you know, this was a major part of their idea, that each of these gods played a different role, and we really know a lot about this stuff because we find them in the Book of the Dead, right? This idea of, you know, did you do good things? Did you take candy from babies? Did you lie? Did you lie about your neighbor in court? Did you commit an affair with your neighbor's wife? And so on, right? These negative confessions, and they would write them down. And the Book of the Dead, which is, you know, so greatly depicted in so many movies and stuff like that, that is not an accurate description of Egypt. This is what they're referring to when they're talking about the Day of Judgment and how all the afterlife works. And it's a very important scene to any ancient Egyptian because this is what's going to happen at the end of your life. Again, Polytheism God. In polytheism, the gods have limited powers because there's so many of them. It's hard for us to kind of wrap our heads around in some senses because, you know, we're at a Catholic school and we're monotheists who believe in an all-powerful God who's all-knowing and all-powerful and is love, who's just and gracious and merciful and holy and righteous. And there's 1,000 attributes that we can put on God and that make him worthy of worship. But in polytheism, the gods are limited. Because their aspect in their reality, you know, they're different. They have different jobs. They have different roles, right? They can be observable. They have human voices, right? Some of them, they're not perfect. Think about Zeus in Greece for a second. I mean, he's the most famous polytheistic god. He's famous for his temper and constantly sleeping with women, human women, conceiving children like Hercules, right? They don't really have this moral perspective, right? Zeus is utterly unworthy of worship. And so why worship a god who's just a guy that a regular dude with superhero powers, right? It doesn't make him a god. But that's how polytheism works. And so it's sometimes hard for us to kind of wrap our head around why they think like this or why they thought like this. But I think it's important that we break it down so that we kind of see and understand where the Egyptians are kind of coming from. I mean, even in the Egyptian culture, they could die. The gods could get sick and die. I mean, Osiris is chopped up into little pieces after he's murdered, and then his wife puts him back together and resurrects him, and he's down in the underworld, and he's like, well, I guess I'm stuck here. I'll just rule it, right? Now, it's a fun story, but in terms of worship, it's not really something that you would say, yeah, that's a great person to worship. Or the sun god, right? Ra. He's probably the most famous Egyptian deity. They believed when the sun rose and journeyed across the sky, and he would bring it across the sky, and then when it sets, it would go under earth into the underworld, and he would fight, you know, a giant, and he'd have to guide it back around the underworld, and then as long as he's victorious in the underworld, the cycle would renew, and the sun would rise again and repeat. And it reflects natural and observable phenomenon, like the movement of the sun, at least from their perspective. And it kind of shows what they're using these gods to do, right? That the gods are kind of viewed as sort of the embodiment of the causes of natural phenomenons and forces of nature and aspects of life. The moon god, you have different gods associated with human existence, like hate and love and death and war. There's a god who gets drunk and goes on murderous killing sprees, and then gets drunk and then they have to stop him, right? And it's kind of ridiculous, sometimes hilarious things, but to kind of keep on that idea that it's hard for us to think about what it means to worship a God like that. And when it comes down to is basically humans are here to take care of them, right? Like they believe that humans had to feed the gods and had so that the gods would do something for you. You look them up if you want. We're not going to talk about each one of them. I don't have time to get into all of them, but there are a number of them. And they all have different kind of appearances, and we've got ones that look like humans. We call that anthropomorphic. We have ones that look like jackals and birds. That's zoomorphic for animal-like. There's an unending list, and they're fun to talk about, and they're fascinating to see what people came up with. But the point that we're really going to focus on is what it was like in ancient life to worship them, okay? And to talk to about everyday life of people, wrapping our heads around how their world was different from ours. I think it's very important to look at, what people were doing at home to actually worship these gods. Ultimately kind of plays out in this mutual dependent relationship. The humans and the gods need each other. And that was kind of the ancient view. And this is just kind of using Egypt as an example because we have so much info on Egypt. But the idea is basically the gods need human worship and human interaction just as much as the humans needed divine protection and aid. Now, which part of this is easiest for us to understand? I don't know. I think as a majority of Christians, and at least, again, here at a Catholic school, we can certainly understand this last bullet point, right? Like humans need divine protection and aid. We do need that, but I think there's a mix there. I think that God is definitely involved in our lives, and we do need him, but I don't think he needs our worship, right? He loves it, right? It's a great thing to do, and the idea of needing it, though, is a little bit different. We don't dress up God's statue and take him food, right, like the ancient groups did. This stela here that we're looking at depicts someone taking something to the god Ra. He's depicted with the sun disk here, the Aten. And, of course, he's got the falcon head, and he has this woman bringing him and offering a plate of food, all vegetables and different foods, and basically they're libation vessels, right? They're meant to fulfill him, okay? Maybe some wine. There's actually a bread loaf in there, and so she's saying here, I'm going to bring you all this wonderful food as a sacrifice, and you're going to return me with a blessing, right? And the rays of the sun are depicted as right here, shining down. And you bring the food in, and the God blesses you with sunlight, essentially. Now, that brings us to temples. I want to make sure you know, for basically quiz purposes, that temples are not churches, because a church is really us, the people. So they're not even church buildings, if you wanted to put it that way. They are not there for communal worship. Ancient peoples don't go to hear sermons and sing a bunch of songs with theology every week at the center of worship, right? That's not their way. They're not communal worship at all. The purposes are for the care and feeding of the gods. And again, that sounds funny to us, but in the temple you had different levels of access in different spaces. So like the outer courtyard, anyone could get into that. The Egyptian inner courtyard, it restricted to where you pretty much had to be a priest. The holiest places, only the priest and king can go in. And common people are kind of kept out of the more sacred spaces. And that brings us to an interesting question. How do you feel connected to a deity if you're kept out all the time? How do you develop a relationship? Well, they did that through religious festivals. And these are quite clever, really. Again, really interesting. They do dozens of these in Egypt throughout the year. The most famous was called the Opet Festival, and that took place in ancient Thebes, where they took Amun-Ra from Karnak to the Luxor Temple. And I'll show you some pictures of Karnak and Luxor in the coming lectures, but those are actually new kingdom sites. But at any rate, this is from one of those temples, and you can kind of see that there's a bond between the gods and the kings to the people, right? And because you don't get to go to the innermost area when they carry the gods from one place to another, you'd be like, oh, hey, we're going to go out in the street and kind of go check it out, right? I'm going to go take my umbrella and bring my family and put my babies on my shoulders, and we're going to watch the procession, right? Because we can see the sun god go by. And so it's like, like a parade, really. It worked, really, because the average Joe Egyptian could not just go and be near the gods, but he could go stand outside and watch them go by on a boat or being carried by, some other Egyptians or slaves or whatever. Then we take a little closer look here on the card. You can kind of see some funny things, right? Like this guy's playing a harp-like instrument. You kind of see these things like a rattle. They're doing back handsprings, and right, they're like making these little shakers, right? And they're clapping. We have these tumblers who are just kind of doing dancing. They carved all of this, and basically they're saying, hey, like it's all along the festival line. And like the Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade, basically. It kind of bonded the people to the gods. And that's really what we would call the state religion of Egypt, the religion that the pharaohs endorsed. And that part, the part that gets them wealthy from the wars, they donate it to the temple, the thing that kind of drives the machine of Egypt forward. And there's also popular worship of household gods. And these are designed to protect the house, the women, the children, because the ancient people are understandably very obsessed with fertility and infant mortality rates. And this is an important topic because I want you to make sure you understand for quiz and test purposes that the average life expectancy is around 40 for much of the ancient history because children die before they hit the age of 2 a lot. So many babies died during the process of birthing, and women would die giving birth, and it really lowered that life expectancy number considerably. If you get to 50 or 60, you're doing pretty well in the ancient world because you had an infant mortality rate of 40 to 50%, which is unbelievable. 40, that's half the babies born died. And if we were living in that reality today, I mean, it'd be insane. Unfortunately for the ancient people, they don't really have modern medicine. They did have superstitions and kind of treatments, but I don't think they really did much that would help, right? I mean, if you say, oh, I'm going to bury this stick under my doorway to keep a demon out so that my wife's pregnancy goes well, you just go ahead and try that and see how well that turns out, right? Like, trinkets are not going to save your wife. You need medical attention. And so we find several of these things, and we kind of know what they're for. And it's really kind of interesting when you think about, what it was an everyday, impact on their lives, and they worshiped these gods and took care of them for that reason. And so, if you look at it like today, like sometimes babies are born with like fluid in their lungs, okay, and it kind of ends up like pretty early on, they'll end up with pneumonia, and you can't hold them right away, and it's awful. No parent wants to has a new baby and wants to hold them and just gets told, no, you can't do that, right? But at the end of the day, we have modern medicine, and if that happens, you're not necessarily worried like, oh, they're just going to die. In the ancient Egyptian world, that was true, but they also had like, interestingly enough, they found this document that basically it had a picture of a woman giving birth, and it basically said something to the effect of, if the baby comes out of the womb and says, wah, and they had like it was almost like an onomatopoeia, right? Like, wah. So if it comes out and says, wah, they have strong lungs, and that means they'll be clean, they're clean, and they'll be able to breathe, and the baby won't die. But if the child is born and it says, wah, then that baby's probably going to die. They don't know why, they don't know how to fix it, they just know from experience, if it says, wah, loud, then that baby's going to be okay. If it says, that baby's not going to do so well. It's really kind of sad that this even existed, but it's true. And so it's very interesting. That leads us to Maat, which was kind of that feather in the scene I showed you earlier, and talks about, for quiz and test purposes, this was really the second most important thing in Egyptian culture that really gave it longevity. It's about truth and order and righteousness. And Maat undergirds the whole Egyptian society. And I think for the second reason, the Nile being the first reason, and Maat being the second, for Egypt's longevity. They view the king as a representative of the gods on earth. He has to uphold Maat. You and I also have to uphold Maat by being lawful and righteous towards each other. If the king doesn't uphold it, though, the whole thing could at least theoretically fall apart. So he has to uphold cosmic order. He has to defeat foreigners. He has to be righteous. He has to give laws. He has to treat each other accordingly. So this is a fundamental concept because it's about a daily beauty, right, for everybody. Make sure that you note that it was for everyone. And I think that this is one of the other reasons why Egypt works for so long. When you have a whole culture buying into this, you can have a pretty solid unity. Of course, we have plenty of issues with these things even today. I'm not saying that, Egyptian had it 100% right, that they were some perfect, just utopia compared to other cultures. I do think that one of the reasons they thrived is because although Pharaoh could kind of just run amok with so much power, they had this concept of Maat that keeps a check and balance on him, that you have to live a certain way or you're in trouble. And I think the fact that you have to keep this does contribute to why Egypt was so successful for so long. This is another scene here. Again, if the heart is as light as a feather, then he'll have a blessed afterlife. If not, they're going to devour his heart and send him on down to a not so good afterlife. And so this is just even more clear, right? So it's a scale. Here's the feather. That's Maat. Here's the heart. We're going to see if it's balanced. When I let go of this, if it balances, if it's balanced, you're good, right? So if not, troubles are coming. All right, and that's going to end this first lecture. And we'll talk about the Old Kingdom and get into the pyramids in the next section.